Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Today we are going full throttle into the world of F1, with the Japanese Grand Prix just around the corner at Suzuka. It is an iconic race and one that we are very much looking forward to. But kind of top of mind for a lot of folks right now is the fortunes of Fernando Alonso and the Aston Martin team.
Right.
And after kind of a tough couple of races for them, we thought we would take a deep dive into kind of where Alonso sits within the team right now.
Yeah.
And what are Aston Martin's prospects looking like as we head to Suzuka.
Yeah.
And then also just kind of looking into some of the financial developments that have been happening with the team.
Absolutely. We've got a lot to unpack.
I do.
We've got some really interesting expert opinions and some big financial news to go through.
Yeah.
And so I think, it's going to be a really interesting deep dive.
Yeah.
And we're going to be looking at, Ralf Schumacher.
Yeah.
Former F1 driver. He had some interesting things to say about Fernando Alonso's talents and potential.
Mm-hmm.
We've got Pedro de la Rosa.
Yeah.
He's got some really, really cool insights into the Suzuka circuit.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we've got some big updates on Lawrence Stroll and his growing investment in Aston Martin.
Yeah.
And just the whole F1 team structure, really.
Yeah. He's making some moves, that's for sure.
He is.
Why don't we just jump right into it? Let's kick it off with Ralf Schumacher.
Yeah.
And what he had to say about Alonso. He said, and I quote, "He's a driver who has won very few world championships for his talent."
Right.
So that's quite a statement. What do you make of that?
Yeah, that's a really strong statement. And I think it reflects, a common sentiment among the F1 community.
Right.
And, Schumacher does kind of go on to suggest that maybe Alonso's past team environments have played a part in that, that relatively low championship tally.
Yeah.
And he says Alonso wasn't the best team player.
Right.
And so, kind of raises the question about how much can internal team dynamics really affect a driver.
Mm-hmm.
Can they help them get to a championship or can they actually hold them back?
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder how this perception of him from the past might actually affect his relationships now within Aston Martin.
Yeah, especially, with these recent retirements.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's, tough spot to be in when the team, you're having issues with the team.
Yeah.
But despite that, Schumacher was so complimentary about Alonso's driving.
Right.
He said, but in terms of performance, he is simply incredible.
Yeah.
So even with those past team dynamics, clearly everyone recognizes that he is just an incredibly gifted driver.
Yeah. And I think he's still got it.
Yeah.
He's coming on 3 years old now.
Yeah.
And he can still perform.
Yeah. He's
still got that raw speed and that ability behind the wheel.
And I think that's something that, we've talked about a little bit before, but I think that's something that is really unique to motorsport.
Mm-hmm.
Where you can be, an athlete who's in their 40s.
Right.
And still competing.
Absolutely.
At the top level.
Absolutely.
You don't see that in so many other sports.
Right. Yeah, you don't see that in football.
Yeah,
you can see that in tennis.
Yeah.
But in motorsport, that experience that you gain over those years really counts for something.
Absolutely.
And the other really interesting thing that Schumacher said was that if Aston Martin can give Alonso a car that's capable of winning,
right,
then he thinks he'll be right back in the fight.
Yeah. And that was a really telling quote. I think he said, if the car takes a step forward, he'll be back. You can't underestimate him.
Right.
It's really all contingent on Aston Martin, I guess, developing a car that's capable of competing in front.
Yeah. That's the big question. Yeah. Can they do it?
And when?
Right. And Schumacher did kind of suggest that we might see a step forward towards the end of the season with a focus on next year's car, of course.
Yeah.
And then, the big regulation changes are coming in 2026.
Yeah.
So I think that's a big year for Aston Martin.
Yeah.
And especially with Honda, coming in as their engine supplier.
Yeah.
That's huge.
Yeah.
And Schumacher also mentioned that they're really excited about the gains they're expecting from their new wind tunnel.
Yeah. That is something that, we've talked about before.
Right.
But just how important these wind tunnels are.
They're massive.
Yeah.
They're absolutely massive.
And, the fact that they're building a new one.
Right.
Is a huge statement of intent.
It is.
it's a very, very big investment.
It is.
And, he actually mentioned that the head of operations there at Aston Martin has said that they were already seeing some positive results in the new facility.
So, yeah, it sounds like there's some underlying optimism there.
Yeah, there's definitely, as we've talked about with the new regulations, there's a lot of teams that are feeling pretty optimistic about their chances. And Aston Martin seems to be one of them.
Absolutely.
Okay, so he also talked a little bit about Alonso's start to this season.
Right.
And said that it's been positive.
Mm-hmm.
But he also kind of threw out this idea that maybe Alonso has lost some of his push or momentum.
Right.
Because he's not consistently at the front.
Yeah, and I think that makes sense.
Yeah.
That initial burst of energy and motivation you get at the start of the season can be difficult to sustain.
Yeah, especially when you're not competing for wins.
Exactly.
Yeah. And he also mentioned that, Lance Stroll is developing as a driver.
Huh.
And so, it kind of adds this really interesting layer to the internal team dynamic.
It does.
How is Aston Martin going to manage this driver pairing going forward?
Absolutely.
And Schumacher also analyzed the recent incidents in Australia and China.
Yeah.
And he said that in Australia, he felt like Alonso drove kind of differently than usual.
Right.
And he said that, the retirement in China was definitely not his fault.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's interesting to hear, from someone who's raced against Alonso.
Right.
He's really carefully looking at his performances.
Yeah.
And trying to understand what's happening.
Yeah. And I think, Schumacher's analysis of Alonso's driving does carry a lot of weight.
Yeah.
He's been there. He's raced against him. He knows what it's like.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think it's really valuable to hear his perspective.
Okay. So let's change gears a little bit.
Okay.
And talk about Suzuka.
Right.
Next stop on the F1 calendar.
Yes.
And Pedro de la Rosa had some great insights into the track.
Yeah, he had some really interesting things to say.
Yeah.
And he really kind of emphasized that Suzuka is just a completely different type of track.
Yeah.
Than a lot of these modern circuits we see these days.
Right.
He called it a real classic and a driver's circuit.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he was kind of contrasting it with a lot of these urban tracks that we're seeing more and more of.
Yeah.
And he described Suzuka as narrow.
Right.
Very unforgiving gravel traps, lining the edges of the track.
So very little room for error.
Yeah, not a lot of room for error.
So that kind of leads me to my next question.
Okay.
What kind of car setup do teams need to be successful at Suzuka?
Yeah, well, De La Rosa kind of went into that.
Yeah.
And he said that, you really need precision, high-speed precision, very quick changes of direction.
Right.
You need good throttle control. And he said that a certain level of courage is essential.
Yeah, when I hear that description, it sounds like Suzuka's a track that really rewards bravery.
Absolutely.
But punishes mistakes.
Yeah.
So, yeah, not for the faint of heart.
No, not at all. And in terms of car setup, he said teams are looking for a car with a really sensitive front end.
Yeah.
For those quick changes in direction.
Mm-hmm.
But it also has to be stable at high speeds.
Right.
And it has to be agile and responsive.
Yeah.
So it's a really tough balance to achieve.
Yeah. And especially, I think, the sensitive front end.
Right.
We've talked before about how crucial that is.
Yeah.
For maximizing grip and responsiveness.
Yeah.
And at Suzuka, with those fast S's in the first sector, even a little bit of understeer can really cost you time.
Absolutely.
And De La Rosa also mentioned how important car performance is for tire degradation.
Yeah.
At Suzuka.
Right.
If the car's not handling well, it's going to really take its toll on those tires.
Yeah. And it's not just that it's slower.
Yeah.
If it's not balanced, if it's not predictable, it's going to be really hard on the tires. Yeah. And that's going to make for a really long and difficult race.
Yeah.
It really shows you how important a good chassis is, especially for a track like Suzuka.
Yeah.
He also had some really interesting insights into the qualifying strategy.
Oh, yeah. What was that?
Yeah, he said that drivers often experience cold brakes.
Right.
Up until turn 10.
Mm-hmm.
And they have to really work them on the outlap to get them up to temperature.
Okay.
So, yeah, it's just another one of those little things that you don't often think about.
Yeah.
But it's really important.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's always the possibility of rain at Suzuka.
Yeah.
And De La Rosa said that adds a whole other level of difficulty.
Yeah. I mean, it really does.
Yeah.
I mean, with, changing grip levels.
Right.
And, Suzuka is so undulating.
Yeah.
So even in the wet,
Yeah.
the amount of standing water can vary so much.
Exactly.
So, yeah, it's a real challenge for the drivers.
It is.
Okay, well, let's switch gears again and talk about the money side of things with Lawrence Stroll.
Okay.
And Aston Martin.
Right.
It sounds like he's making some pretty big moves.
Yeah, he is. So the latest news is that Lawrence Stroll, through his investment vehicle U-Tree Consortium, which is basically just a group of investors that he's using for this,
right,
is planning to increase his ownership in Aston Martin to 33%.
Wow.
With an investment of £74 million.
That's a lot of money.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. And this is part of a bigger strategy by Aston Martin to raise $150 million.
Wow.
So, they're really looking to invest in the brand.
Yeah, and Stroll has actually said that this increased investment really shows his belief in the brand.
Right.
And he's committed to, creating long-term value.
Yeah. He said he has a strong conviction in this extraordinary brand.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, he's in it for the long haul.
Yeah.
And, it's also worth mentioning that the value of the Aston Martin F1 team has gone up significantly.
Yeah.
It's now estimated to be worth something like $2.4 billion.
Wow.
So, that makes them a very attractive asset.
Yeah.
To potential investors.
Yeah, which brings us to the news that Stroll is selling part of the F1 team.
Right.
So what's the thinking behind that?
Yeah, well, it seems like the main reason is to really focus on the parent company, Aston Martin, the car manufacturer.
Right.
And they're facing some challenges right now. There's delivery issues and supply issues. And that's often, because of these really complex networks of component manufacturers.
Right.
And that, really impacts production timelines.
Yeah.
And then they're also facing decreased demand in some key markets like China.
Right.
And tariffs in the U.S.
Yeah.
So the money they get from selling this minority stake in the F1 team is going to go back into the main automotive business.
Yeah.
And, hopefully help them address these challenges.
Yeah. So it makes sense from a business perspective.
It does.
But it does raise questions about the ownership of the F1 team in the future.
Yeah.
And, there's been some talk about Saudi Aramco.
Right.
And their potential involvement.
Yeah.
So what do we know about that?
Well, it's still a bit uncertain, to be honest.
Yeah.
Stroll has said that he's committed to Aston Martin being an F1 for the long term.
Right.
For decades to come.
Yeah.
But these changes in ownership do suggest that maybe other entities like Saudi Aramco could play a bigger role.
Yeah.
In the team's structure and direction.
Yeah. Oh, that's something to keep an eye on for sure.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's try and connect all the dots here.
Okay.
We've got Schumacher saying that he believes in Alonso's talent, but he's also saying that Aston Martin really needs to give him a better car.
Right.
And then we have De La Rosa, who's telling us just how demanding Suzuka is, for both the driver and the car.
Yeah.
And then we've got Stroll, who's making all these financial moves.
Yeah.
Increasing his investment in Aston Martin.
Yeah.
But also selling part of the F1 team.
Yeah.
So how does all this fit together?
Yeah. Well, I think what's really interesting is how these different elements actually kind of work together.
Right.
Schumacher's belief in Alonso just puts more pressure on Aston Martin to deliver a car that can win.
Right.
And then De La Rosa's description of Suzuka really highlights the fact that if there are any weaknesses in the AMR25, they're going to be exposed at Suzuka.
Yeah.
That need for a sensitive front end and stability at high speeds, that's what De La Rosa was talking about. Yeah. And those are things that Aston Martin have been struggling with.
Right.
So, it's all connected.
Yeah. And then what about Stroll's investments?
Right.
And this partial sale of the team.
Yeah, well, I think the fact that he's putting more money into the company shows that he's committed to Aston Martin as a whole. And that includes the F1 team.
Right.
And even though he's selling part of the team, his priority seems to be making sure that the whole organization is financially healthy. And that could actually benefit the F1 team in the long run.
Yeah.
By giving them a more stable platform.
Right.
And, they're still focused on developing the car for this year.
Yeah.
And they're already looking ahead to 2026. So there's a plan in place.
Yeah.
And I think these financial moves are just a way of making sure that they have the resources to execute that plan.
So it sounds like Suzuka is going to be a really important race.
I think so.
For both Alonso and Aston Martin.
Yeah, it's a chance for them to kind of bounce back after those retirements.
Yeah.
And, it's also a chance for them to gather some data on the car's performance.
Yeah.
And that's going to be really valuable for their development going forward.
Yeah, Suzuka really is a test for these cars.
It is.
It's got a bit of everything.
Yeah.
High-speed corners, slow corners, elevation changes.
Right.
So, yeah, it's a good opportunity to see where they're at.
It is.
All right. Well, that was a great deep dive.
Yeah.
Let's just kind of recap real quick.
Okay.
We heard from Ralf Schumacher, who still believes in Alonso's talent.
Right.
We learned from Pedro de la Rosa just how challenging Suzuka is.
Yeah.
And then we got some insight into Lawrence Stroll's financial strategy.
Right.
And I think the takeaway here is that there's this really interesting interplay between Alonso's ability, the demands of Suzuka, and the financial moves that are happening at Aston Martin.
Right.
And all of those things are going to play a part in their success in the future.
Absolutely. It's a compelling narrative as we head to Japan.
Yeah, it really is. And that's kind of leads me to my final thought for everyone listening.
Okay.
So with Alonso's talent and Aston Martin's investments, what do you think is the most important thing that needs to happen for Alonso to achieve more success in F1?
Right.
Is it the development of a car that can win?
Yeah.
Is it strategic decisions by the team? Or is it something else entirely?
Right.
It's a complex question.
It is.
And there's no easy answer.
No.
But it's something to think about.
Yeah.
And we'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah. Let us know in the comments.
Yeah, let us know in the comments.
Absolutely.
But for now, we're going to wrap it up here.
Okay.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and we will catch you next time.
Sounds good.